We're right back to where we started. The Iranian leadership is still the Iranian leadership. Yes, we took out Ali Khamenei, but it's still the same apocalyptic, eschatological Islamists who were there going back to 1979.
With the Memorandum of Understanding, with the attempted peace deal, do you think the White House recognizes that it was an error to pursue that?
It will never be a stable peace unless you actually finish the job on its own terms. It actually gave Iran and Oman power to form their own duopoly cartel to charge whatever tolls or fees they wanted, signing off on up to $300 billion of new investment to rebuild the Iranian infrastructure. There's no logic behind this.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Josh Hammer. Josh, welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure, Brendan. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. I'm constantly trying to figure out what's happening across the pond in the United States. It's a country and a politics I try to follow as closely as possible, but I always have loving guests on who can shed some light on what's happening there, and you are definitely one of those people. So I want to ask you about a few things happening in your country, or to begin with, in fact, something that's happening outside of your country, which looks like the resumption of the war in Iran. You know, there was all this talk a few weeks ago about a memorandum of understanding, a possible peace deal, which lots of people considered to be very, very controversial. That seems to have been fallen apart. Trump now thinks they're scum who he can't really deal with, and there's been some more military interaction. What do you make of what's happening with the Iran war right now?
It's highly predictable. I entirely foresaw this coming, Brendan. And I mean, not to toot my own horn, but I was very critical of the MOU. I was very critical of negotiations that were happening in Switzerland. Not that I don't want peace. On the contrary, I very much want peace. But unfortunately, sometimes we know that the only way to get through peace is to act in militant and vociferous fashion, and to actually finish the job and to actually get a stable peace. There will never be a stable peace unless you actually finish the job on its own terms. This is kind of my initial criticism of the administration's handling of this war, Brendan, to be honest with you, is that I'm not sure we've ever gotten a crystal clear explanation as to what exactly the goals are. So for me personally, as a conservative, as an American, someone who supported this war, to me, the goals were fairly obvious. It was the free-flowing opening of the Strait of Hormuz, the end of Iran's funding of their terrorist proxies in the region, some resolution to the ballistic missile issue, and then some resolution to the nuclear issue. It struck me as pretty clear, but I never heard it fully explained by the administration. And that is why I fear we've had all this chaotic, at times schizophrenic, back and forth ever since the April 8th ceasefire, where it was a ceasefire and then there were all these weird negotiations. We had J.D. Vance fly to Pakistan, then he almost flew a second time, and then he didn't. Then we had the Switzerland MOU, and then it was Qatar. Now we're right back where we started. And we're right back where we started because we never defined what the end goal was in the first place. And the corollary of that is that the Iranian leadership is still the Iranian leadership. Yes, we took out Ali Khamenei, but it's still led by the same Islamist, apocalyptic, 12th Imam, eschatological Islamists who were there going back to 1979. So I'm hardly surprised that this is back where we are. I feel bad in some ways for the administration because I know that President Trump and his inner circle, they desperately want this issue to go away. They desperately want to be able to focus on the economy, inflation, all the domestic issues in order to ride the troops in advance of the contentious midterm elections this November. I totally get that, but what I've said, Brendan, is that the quickest way to do that is to rip this Band-Aid off quickly. I mean, we've been here now for 3 plus months since the April 8th ceasefire, and we're right back to where we started. So hopefully this time is actually the beginning of the end, but I suppose we'll see how the next week or two plays out.
That's a very useful outline, and your suggestion for what the policy aims should be, I think, are good ones that most people would agree with. But why do you think there was that inability or unwillingness, perhaps, for the administration to outline what the mission of the conflict, what the mission of the war was? Did they not know? Was there always that kind of caginess about regime change? Because, of course, that was a huge question mark dangling over the Trump administration. You know, you promised us an end to forever wars. You promised us an end to regime change wars. Is this a regime change war? That's what a lot of people were asking. What do you think explains the confusion in terms of the messaging coming out of the White House?
So listen, there are some people who have openly called for regime change. My friend Mark Levin has done that. I, for what it's worth, have not been one of them. I have not openly called for a regime change war. It was not one of my enumerated goals for this conflict. I think actually that what I said can be accomplished without boots on the ground, without a deliberate effort to try to change regime. Look, on the one hand, Donald Trump did run against these conflicts. That's very true. On the other hand, he's been a vociferous critic of the Islamist regime in Tehran, literally since its very first days. There's this grainy old footage of 1980, during the height of the Iran hostage crisis, the crisis that ended the Jimmy Carter presidency. Donald Trump's on American television criticizing Carter for not going hard enough to free the hostages. So he's been a critic over and over and over again. He got us out of Barack Obama's nuclear deal, took out Qasem Soleimani, and on and on. So he has a very clear, consistent track record on the issue of Iran, even while simultaneously he does call, it's true, for no forever wars, no regime change wars. I think the administration, Brendan, and this is just a guess on my part, but if I'm hazarding a guess, I think they're probably feeling a little cocky after the staggering success of Venezuela. So Venezuela was in early January. That was absolute resolve was the military name for that operation. They swooped in overnight. A remarkable Hollywood film-esque operation, frankly. You have the U.S. Delta Force, top-tier special operatives go in there, swoop out from the dead of the night. Nicolas Maduro, he's guarded by Cuban militants, probably some Hezbollah commandos too, if I had to guess there. They bring him out to New York City to face these long-standing pressing charges. And they were probably feeling a little cocky, and they saw how Iran was butchering tens of thousands of their people in the streets of the country, and they said, let's try to do what we did in Venezuela. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. Every country is different. Every country has its own unique challenges. Every regime is different. So I think that is partially the explanation for the lack of a crystal clear explanation. But ultimately, we were owed and deserved some more of a straightforward explanation. It's probably why you've seen the country fracture so heavily along these lines. When you have a very clear unifying goal, the American people are willing to rally around it. But when it's not articulated, not sold to people, especially for a war-weary public, it's going to go less well.
So give us a sense of your problem with the Memorandum of Understanding, with the attempted peace deal, with J.D. Vance jetting back and forth or not jetting back and forth, depending on what the state of play was. I mean, the memorandum was staggeringly unpopular amongst a lot of conservative commentators in the US and in Europe as well. They were incredibly worried about what it indicated about the Trump administration and to the Islamic Republic in the sense that it looked to some people like it was a kind of victory by the back door for the Islamic regime, in terms of them getting what they want or seeming to have more sense of power than they deserve, obviously. What was your issue with that process? And do you now think it's just fallen apart? Do you think the White House recognizes that it was an error to pursue that?
So on the first question, I object on similar lines as what you just said. It seems to me that it was essentially giving Iran victory. I mean, the analogy is as follows. So we're during the World Cup here. Let's say that England trots out and they're absolutely crushing the opposition. It's 5-0 at halftime. And in a situation like that, you go for the win. You don't come out of the halftime locker room when you're crushing the opposition, begging for a draw, begging for a penalty kick shootout. That was essentially the optics, what I saw in the United States-Iran conflict. Really beginning with that April 8th premature ceasefire. But the MOU on the actual terms itself, of the 4 goals that I outlined, I'm not sure a single one of them actually was guaranteed by the MOU. The Hormuz issue was alluded to, but barely. It actually gave Iran and Oman power to form their own sort of duopoly cartel to charge whatever tolls or fees they wanted, which they actually initially announced they were doing during the MOU negotiations in Switzerland. As of earlier this week, that's apparently not happening because Iran was actually bombing Oman. So much for that new Iran-Oman partnership. But this also, the MOU, there was a term in there about the United States signing off on up to $300 billion of new investment to rebuild the Iranian infrastructure. Why in the world would we do that? There's just no logic behind this. Typically, when you are the victorious power in a war, you want to be magnanimous and try to hold the peace and try to make the other country not hate you. maybe you will help rebuild. Gets back to World War II and the Marshall Plan and all that. But that's clearly not what this is. We have transparently not finished the job in any meaningful sense. Why would we be signing off on them just building more money to try to fund all their terrorist proxies, fund the IRGC, fund the ballistic missiles, fund the nukes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And it did seem to empower the worst elements of the regime as well. I'm not convinced that there are a whole lot of so-called moderates within this regime at all. But it certainly seems like the optics of the way that this played out in Switzerland was that it was emboldening all of the worst actors, the true radicals in the IRGC. And if there are any so-called moderates, which again I'm skeptical, I think they were basically sidelined and that the hardliners tended to win out. At this point, I think that Trump publicly has turned on the MOU. He says that is basically done. And that does raise a pretty interesting question as to what that means for the vice president, what that means for J.D. Vance, who was very much the public face of this, who negotiated this, who sold it, who was very proud of it. I think what the vice president would probably say is that we gave it a good try, and the opposition tended to, well, they just didn't respect it because they are who we thought they were. They are radical Islamists. The problem is that the regime got real relief. They got real relief from this months and months of iterative back and forth ceasefires or quasi-ceasefires. Even after the MOU was announced about a month and a half ago initially, when it was first announced, they got immediate relief when it came to the oil as well. So within days, really within hours of it first being announced, a lot of American sanctions were lifted for Iranian oil exports. Indeed, a lot of Iranian assets and overseas bank accounts were actually unfrozen. So they got immediate relief. Earlier this week, President Trump now saying that the U.S. naval blockade is going back on. So I guess that's trying to be unwound. But we could have saved a lot of this ridiculousness, frankly, for just not trying to do this bit of schizophrenia and just staying on a very consistent line the whole time.
I wanted to ask you about an issue close to your heart and close to the heart of many of the listeners to this podcast, which is Israel. One of the questions that has come up time and again over the past few months is whether there is a divergence between America's war aims and Israel's war aims. And of course, the Jewish state would rather not live next to an apocalyptic Islamic regime, which funds the mass murder of Jews, which funds various armies of anti-Semites, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. When I speak to friends of mine in Israel, they're pretty clear that, they would like a proper showdown with the Islamic Republic. They would like it to be defeated or at least very, very strongly put back in its box. And that seemed to clash at times with the slightly more limited aims of the White House. And of course, there was loads of media coverage about divergence between these two countries. It's hard to see if that was being overstated from an anti-Israel sentiment, which is not a surprising sentiment in the mainstream media, or if there's some truth to it. What's your understanding of that discussion?
So it's hard to say, and I'm not trying to be coy here, but it's hard to say because I think the United States actually was not really clear, frankly, what our goals were in this conflict. I think if we had actually articulated our goals clearly, and then Netanyahu had articulated his goals, Israel's goals, then we would have very clearly seen. But we never really got that, frankly, from the administration. Now, here's what I will say. I think that the Israeli government would be more gung-ho about going for the jugular, going for regime change for the sake of regime change, which, by the way, is actually not the Israeli national instinct in a lot of these conflicts. So going back to the Iraq invasion in 2002, in my book, Israel and Civilization, I talk about this quite a bit, actually. There's been this whole historical rewriting debate. A lot of the anti-Semites say, "Oh, Israel tricked George W. Bush into going to Iraq." It's actually not the case. In fact, Ariel Sharon, who was the leader of the Israeli right at the time, Netanyahu was out of power. Ariel Sharon told President Bush, "Don't do this." Actually, why? Because you're toppling a regime who's going to fill that vacuum of power, Iran. This is what the Israelis said, and Bush didn't listen. And Iraq to this day is basically an Iranian satrapy in many ways. So the Israeli instinct in many ways is not to go for regime change. I think in Iran they actually would make an exception. I think the meaning Israeli would pursue regime change in a vacuum, in a bubble, for the sake of regime change, because this regime is in many ways uniquely vile. Along with North Korea, they're probably one of the two most rogue, despotic, totalitarian, tyrannical, terror exporting regimes on the face of planet Earth. So to the extent that that is an explicit goal and that it's not the United States, then I guess there is a divergence. But it seems to me that Israel also, Brendan, always understood that they are the junior partner in this binational alliance. I don't think Netanyahu would object to that formulation. I don't think any Israeli would object to that. Israel is a tiny country. It is a much smaller military, way smaller. It's smaller in virtually every way imaginable, frankly. So I think that there is also an element of due deference to the senior partner in this alliance. But now the United States is earnestly engaging in military hostilities again. What I've heard from the Israeli side, based on just the public media that I've consumed, is that they seem to be saying that, look, if you guys want us, we're more than happy to go in there. In fact, we would probably be eager to do so. So they're very happy to help out. But I also don't think that they would pursue any goals that are explicitly contrary to what the senior part of the United States wants. For instance, they will not take any kill shots for any regime leaders while there is an MOU negotiating period. In fact, Netanyahu was actually just on the Sunday talk shows here in the United States on Sunday saying that if President Trump wants to continue to pursue the MOU, because technically we're only about halfway through this 60-day period the MOU countenances, Netanyahu was saying that if Trump wants to continue this through the end, Israel says, no problem, go for it. So there's a lot of deference. But yes, on the margins, there's probably a slight difference, but I don't think it's more than the margins. Let's not forget, kind of just backing up here and kind of zooming out. Let's not forget that this regime, the Iranian regime, their very, very first action, like literally the first thing they did in 1979 when they toppled the Shah, was to run not to the Israeli embassy, because Israel had relations with the Shah. Okay, Israel was inside the country back then. Their first instinct was to run to the American embassy and to commence this hostage crisis. So this has been a viciously anti-American regime since day one. President Trump, again, has understood that more than anyone probably in modern American history. So I think the administration is quite clear-eyed when it comes to Iran. But as far as tactics and to an extent, maybe in the margins goals, there's probably a slight difference. But again, that difference, I think, is alleviated and mitigated by the deference from the junior partner Israel to the senior partner of the United States.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it always makes me laugh that the anti-Semitic left, one moment they are saying that Israel is this all-powerful kind of global octopus that is dragging America into wars against its will. And then the next minute they're laughing because Trump publicly reprimands Israel and says, don't do this. And suddenly they're enjoying the fact that Israel is this little partner who's been told off. So they can't seem to make their minds up about what Israel represents. I wanted to ask you about Israel's standing in the US. Israel's standing in Europe is very poor, despite the best efforts of some of us who are trying to make the case for the existence and flourishing of the Jewish nation. I read quite often that in America, support for Israel is going down, especially amongst younger generations and certain minority groups and so on. How true is that? And how worried do you think Israel needs to be? Because, of course, it is in a partnership with America more so than it is with other nations. It's one thing that it has the White House on its side for the most part, but if it loses the American public, that could be a problem. How real is that problem?
So it depends what part of the American political spectrum we're talking about. So the shift against Israel on the left is very, very real. This has been happening for a long time. I think Barack Obama really brought to the next level. His whole Hope and Change 2008 coalition really precipitated much of this modern anti-Israel politics. And now in a post-October 7th environment where the DSA, the Democrats, Social America, are taking over the party, it's becoming an organizing principle, frankly, for the modern Democratic Party. So Ruth Weiss, the venerable professor at Harvard University, famously describes anti-Semitism as the organization of politics against the Jews. That's dangerously close to what we are currently seeing in the modern Democratic Party. Zohar Mamdani is elected mayor of the nation's largest city, frankly, the city that also has the largest Jewish population in the world, on a platform that talks a little bit about housing and so forth, but is really, really, really heavy on the anti-Semitic wink, wink, nudge, nudging. And you've seen recent victories, people like Daria Lisa Chevalier in the congressional primary in New York City just a few weeks ago, running on a platform that seems to prioritize this tiny foreign conflict. Even Graham Plattner, when he just dropped out finally, the scandal-plagued reprobate, he finally drops out of his race in Maine, and in his indignant, not-so-conciliatory resignation letter, he ends it by saying F ICE and free Palestine. So this is becoming a massive principle on the left, and I'm not sure the left is coming back anytime soon. In fact, there was an appalling recent panel on CNN just about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, I believe it was, they had on, they were talking about John Ossoff, the Jewish senator from Georgia, and Josh Shapiro, the Jewish governor of Pennsylvania. They're both Democrats, and they're talking about their 2020 presidential prospects. And the on-air presenter said that, well, if we're talking about who has a better chance 2028, it's worth noting that Josh Shapiro reads as more Jewish, which is a way of saying that he comes across as, well, more Jewish, as more Jewy, which is like a handicap. It's a bad thing in the Democratic primary. That's the implicit point of the CNN presenter. I mean, that is a worlds removed from 2000, where Al Gore won the popular vote with an observant Jew, Joe Lieberman, as his running mate. So that party, that movement is gone on this issue. I'm not sure it's coming back anytime soon. It's probably only going to get worse. God forbid, I fear. The right is a lot more complicated. So if you look at the polls, the overwhelming majority, it's really a vast majority of Republicans still support Israel, still are very high. There was a very interesting recent poll here on our Independence Day on July 4th, where I believe it was a YouGov poll. They polled both Republicans and Democrats. What are your favorite flags? And Democrats, their favorite flags are the American flag, but also like the rainbow flag, Black Lives Matter, etc. For Republicans, overwhelming number one favorite flag is the Stars and Stripes, the American flag. The number two, number three favorite flags, and four, they were all pretty close, was the Gadsden flag, Don't Tread on Me, the blue, thin blue line flag, and the Israeli flag. And if you look at the polls, even among self-identified MAGA Republicans, support for Israel is very, very high. It does get more complicated in the younger generation. So there is some polling that shows, some polling, not all, some polling that shows that among the 1835 demographic, there is a softening, at times a severe softening of support, even within the right when it comes to support for Israel. Even that, though, has some counter data points. So, for instance, I think back to the Turning Point USA America Fest conference in Phoenix, Arizona last December, the first big conference they had after the horrific assassination of my friend Charlie Kirk. And there were like 30 to 40,000 people there, a massive turnout at this conference. And they did a push poll of the attendees on a bunch of issues. One of them was this question. They asked all the attendees, do you consider Israel to be America's greatest ally, one of many allies, or no ally? No ally got 13%, which means that in this very young audience, 87% said that they're either the greatest ally or an ally. So the data even there is complicated, but that's a live fight. That's a live fight that's happening. Right now you have some very loud, outspoken opponents, people like Tucker Carlson, people like Megyn Kelly, and so forth. But I think it's very much an open question as to whether or not they will win the day. And it kind of ties back to our earlier conversation. I think the way that the Iran conflict plays out will actually have some bearing, not full bearing, but will have at least some bearing on that question as well.
Yeah, it's not dissimilar in the UK, amongst the younger right, the digital right, or what I sometimes refer to as the crank right, which are people who are online way too much. There is this growing suspicion of Israel, and they often sound quite radically left-wing in the way they talk about it. But then on the Conservative Party and in Nigel Farage's Reform Party, there's still a very strong support for Israel. So it's not a clear-cut situation where the right has abandoned the Jewish state. You mentioned Zoran Mamdani. He's obviously a politician that we in Britain are intrigued by, the fact that there is this socialist in control of New York City. We're following it quite closely. I've been quite horrified by some of the arguments he's been putting forward and some of the allies he's made. You mentioned Chevalier, the Democratic Socialist in New York. The thing that horrified me most about her is that she went on one of the 8th of October protests. She went on the 8th of October protest in Manhattan. I know we should always give people the benefit of the doubt, but in my mind, anyone who went on an 8th of October protest as the pogrom was still happening should just be written off as the scum of the earth. That's my view. We had them in London. There was a famous one in Sydney, in Berlin, people pouring onto the streets essentially to celebrate the mass murder of Jews. What is the how would you explain the centrality of Israel to the mindset of Mamdani and the other kind of up-and-coming radicals around him? Is it just anti-Semitism, or is it part of that kind of third worldist agenda? Is it anti-Westernism? How do you explain why it's become such a central feature? So
it's all the above, but I think of what you just said. I think anti-Westernism really is kind of the ultimate guiding principle. You think about what the radical left seeks to do. Think about what Karl Marx tried to do. Karl Marx wrote about a global revolution of the proletariat over the capital class. Ultimately, though, he was calling for the overthrowing of Christendom itself, where Christendom was synonymous to him with Western civilization, and rightfully so, because I argue that Western civilization is just the outflow of the biblical inheritance. But if you want to start there, it makes sense, albeit in a logical, diabolical way, to start with the original people of the book, the original people of the Bible, the original people who received God's word at Mount Sinai. And that's why Marx, it's right there. He actually wrote his pamphlet on the Jewish question before he even wrote the Communist Manifesto. And I think that's why a lot of these people that ultimately want to overthrow the United States, want to overthrow contemporary Christendom, they start with Judaism and the Jewish state. It's actually right there. So this woman Chevalier is actually a great example. So she was one of the founders of Columbia University Apartheid Divest, which is the Columbia University student group. Nominally, purportedly, it's just dedicated to abolishing Israel, Palestinian rights, etc., etc. But if you actually look at their stated goals in their bylaws, what they actually say they're for nothing less than the eradication of the United States of America. This is also Black Lives Matter's explicit goal. They call for the eradication of America. This is an increasingly common, at times ubiquitous sentiment on the left. You have all these crop of radicals who are trying to at times justify 9/11. So this woman who was just elected out in Colorado, I believe she's of Ethiopian origin, if I'm not mistaken, was kind of sort of saying, well, 9/11, I mean, what do you expect? You're gonna meddle so much, you're gonna topple these regimes, they're gonna lash out. So it really is coming from this fundamentally anti-Western place. And a corollary to that, which is an argument that I have in my book as well, Israel and Civilization, is it's coming also from a genuine conviction of globalism and anti-nationalism. So one of the reasons I argue that the United Nations is so fixated on Israel is that Israel, in many ways, is a quintessential nationalist endeavor. It's a very nationalist endeavor. There are flags everywhere. There's conscription. There's mandatory military service. And there's actually a very long history for that. I would actually argue that the biblical antecedent for the contemporary nation state was King David uniting the tribes in the capital of Jerusalem. That's kind of the ancient antecedent. And back in antiquity, you could actually contrast that with the vision of empire that was put forward by the Romans. So you have empire versus the nation state. And if you hate the nation state, if you just want liberal utopia, if you want liberal empire, if you want globalism, if you want unicorn farts and John Lennon's song Imagine, then you're going to go after the strident nationalism, the strident particularism of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. And that particularism, which really has been this refusal to bow to the homogenizing forces of globalism, of utopianism, that's really the Jewish people's calling card throughout the ages for thousands of years. And ultimately is both our greatest strength and also the greatest reason why a lot of people tend to hate us, because we just refuse to bend the knee and to bow down to all these would-be globalist forces. And that accounts, I think, for a lot of anti-Semitism, but also a lot of this obsession, frankly, really just obsession with Israel. So I think it's that, but even more so than that, it's kind of what I said earlier, which is this desire to genuinely tear down Christendom, Western civilization, and you start logically with the original biblical religion, which is Judaism and the Jewish state.
Yeah. In Europe, we say that the lesson Europe took from the Second World War is that nationalism is terrible. And the lesson the Jews took from the Second World War is that we really need a nation. Otherwise, we're screwed. So that's the fork in the road. And you can see the hostility that is now generated. All these globalist Europeans who hate the Zionist entity more than anything in the world. And it really kind of springs from all of that, those earlier sense of animus. I wanted to ask you about the genocide libel, because it's still very strong on the left in particular. I sometimes think to myself, a lot of the kind of woke myths of the left are starting to fall apart. Certainly in the UK, for example, trans women are women. That's kind of falling down now. The idea that diversity is our strength, that is now openly called into question by lots of people. But the one lie that still clings on is the idea that Israel is committing a genocide, which seems to me to be one of the most dangerous lies of our time. Is that still widespread in the US? I guess it is on the American left. But what do you think what's the state of it there, and what might be done to try and dislodge this idea from people's minds?
Listen, it's a great question. So it is definitely a widespread sentiment on the left. So you had Scott Wiener, who for a long time refused to call it genocide, was just criticizing the Netanyahu government and so forth. And he was actually, himself, a very, very far left gay Jewish man, was actually, in the shocking footage, was booed out of the LGBT parade in San Francisco for not calling it genocide. And in fact, Ro Kahana, who's now clearly running for president in 2028, congressman from California, just got back from Israel, had this whole ridiculous stage photo op of playing the victim card. He said that he was arrested or stopped by these horrible machine gun wielding Israelis. Like bro, it's called a checkpoint. It's pretty common actually. But he's now criticizing Democrats who won't call it genocide. So it's very, very common on the left. On the right, listen, you'll see it from Tucker Carlson. You'll see it from Marjorie Taylor Greene. People who, I mean, whether you want to call it the woke right, the retard right, I kind of like the latter, frankly, the retard right. People who take an almost pro-Russia, pro-China at time view of geopolitics. Marjorie Taylor Greene's gotten very close to Code Pink, which is basically a Chinese influence operation here in the United States. People who buy into these foreign operations, and by the way, this is one of the great ironies, right? Is a lot of people say, oh, the Jews are running these foreign information operations. But in reality, a lot of it's actually coming from hostile actors like Russia, China, in some ways Qatar, et cetera. So people who are part of that ecosystem, who are following Alexander Dugin, the Rasputin for Vladimir Putin, and there actually is that niche. That's a real niche here in America, unfortunately. I think it's terrible. People who are in that Dugin-adjacent bubble on the right, or the quote-unquote right, will accuse Israel of genocide. It's really not particularly big beyond that. As you correctly point out, is one of the most infamous libels or horrific libels in contemporary political discourse. I mean, for starters, the Arab population in Gaza has absolutely exploded over the past 30, 40, 50 years, whatever sample size you want to use, typically not how a genocide is actually done. And the numbers in this are just so overwhelming. I mean, think about the actual civilian to combatant death ratio. So John Spencer, who's now all over the news, he's the head of urban studies at West Point, probably the Western world's foremost expert in urban warfare. The numbers that he has crunched show that the war in Gaza was the single most humane. I know a lot of people might be laughing. It's the single most humane war in the history of modern urban warfare when it comes to a civilian to combatant death ratio. Is actually 1.5 to 1, which was better than how the United States did in Fallujah fighting ISIS 2016. Back then, it was actually 2.5 to 3 to 1, give or take. So that's what I try to do, Brendan, is I try to talk about facts because I live in a very stubborn world sometimes where I think facts don't matter. This is kind of the greatest problem of all, though, is how do you make facts and logic and reason matter in an age that is driven by clicks and algorithms and social media virality, and above all, really just emotions. I think sometimes about my friend Ben Shapiro, whose famous catchline about a decade ago. Ben said that facts don't care about your feelings. And that probably was true when he said it, but it's just not true anymore. And I think one of our great struggles is how we make it true again, because that's the world that I want to live in, but unfortunately, it's just not the world that we currently live in.
Okay, Josh, my last question for you is time to get your crystal ball out and tell us what you think might come next, because you've got the midterms coming up. We get flashes of coverage about the midterms here. For example, the Graham Plattner controversy, which I enjoyed very much, well, in terms of when he stood down, and the egg on the face of all the bigwig Democrats who supported him for so long. And of course, we see the rise of the radical Democrats and the Mamdani fan club and so on. And then, as you said earlier, is the Iran war going to drag on? Will that harm Trump and Vance and the standing of the Republicans? There's a lot at stake, it seems to me, in the midterms. What's your sense of how they might play out? And more broadly, what do you think really is going to be at the heart of this election? So
listen, the overwhelming majority of American elections, the exit polls tell a very similar story, which is it's the economy. It really is the economy. Virtually every election, there are exceptions. So 2002, post 9/11 midterm election, there are some exceptions, but the overwhelming majority of American elections, economy, inflation, cost of living, these are the issues, wages, jobs, these are the issues that American voters vote on. So I think it's a little early to say, frankly, and a bit of a cop-out, I realize, because voters also have a very short memory. So if things start to change quite a bit over the next few months, then I could see Republicans easily keeping both chambers. Let's not forget that there also was a major back and forth iterative battle of partisan congressional redistricting that happened earlier this year. And Republicans actually won that battle. Republicans actually are going to net about, give or take, 10 to 15 seats in the Congress just as a result of drawing congressional lines. Texas added 4 to 5 Republican seats. Florida, where I live, added 4. Various other states as well. California netted a few, but not nearly enough to keep up. There's also a very important Supreme Court case as well, probably a little bit beyond the scope of our conversation. But the point is that holding everything aside, just focus on seats created and taken away, Republicans will gain 10 to 15. So they already have a few seat cushion. So they would have to essentially lose November by 20 seats or more in order to lose the House. Is that going to happen? It's entirely possible, okay? The administration's approval ratings are not great at the moment, but here's the thing. When you actually ask which party is more popular, currently the Democrats still poll as more unpopular than Republicans in a simple thumbs up, thumbs down. And this is, in my estimation, this is entirely the fault of the radical wing of the Democratic Party. People like Chevalier, like Mamdani, they are very popular in these far left jurisdictions. They are not very popular where normal Americans live, in suburbia, in places like that. So I could actually totally foresee a world in which Republicans do keep both chambers, the Senate and the House, come this November. In fact, I do think that they will keep the Senate. They have a bit of a structural advantage. Democrats are now in an even worse spot because of the situation with Graham Plattner in Maine. So I think Republicans will keep the Senate. The House, I could genuinely see go either way. It's going to depend, I think, on the economy as it gets closer. I guess I will make a slightly bold prediction and say that despite all the deluge of negative press about President Trump, I actually think that Republicans will probably keep the House as well. So I'll go ahead and predict that Republicans actually will keep both the House and the Senate come next January.
Josh, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.